In the year 123 BC, a tribune of the Roman people named Gaius Gracchus stands before the popular assembly and proposes a law. The lex frumentaria, as it will be known, is straightforward in its mechanics. The Roman state will purchase grain from the provinces and sell it to the citizens of Rome at a fixed price, well below the market rate, through a network of public distribution points across the city. No citizen will be turned away. No means test will be applied. The price is the price, available to all, regardless of whether the man buying the grain is a destitute freedman sleeping in a tenement or a moderately prosperous craftsman with a workshop and 3 apprentices. The grain is there. It is cheap. Come and take it. The senators who oppose the measure understand immediately what Gaius Gracchus is doing. He is not running a charity. He is building a constituency. The urban population of Rome in 123 BC is somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people, the largest concentration of human beings in the Western world, crammed into a city whose housing stock consists primarily of towering multi-story tenements called insulae, whose ground floors are occupied by workshops and taverns, and the slightly less miserable poor, whose upper floors are packed with the slightly more miserable poor, and whose entire population depends on a food supply system that arrives by ship from Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa, subject to the weather, to pirates, to the incompetence of contractors, and to every other uncertainty that attaches to moving large quantities of perishable commodities across open water. Grain prices in Rome fluctuate wildly. A good sailing season with favorable winds and no storms brings cheap grain and a calm city. A bad season, a late convoy, a blight in Sicily, any of these can send prices upward in a matter of weeks. And a city of 1 million people paying twice the usual price for bread is a city with a great deal of time and anger and nowhere particularly productive to direct either. The Roman mob is a political force of genuine consequence, capable of disrupting elections, intimidating senators, and in extreme cases, burning buildings. Gaius Gracchus, a man of radical democratic convictions and considerable tactical intelligence, understands that the urban poor of Rome are a political resource waiting to be organized, and that the most direct route to their loyalty is through their stomachs. The lex frumentaria passes. The subsidized grain distribution begins, and within a generation, the Roman state discovers the first and most durable of the trap's teeth. You cannot take it back. The grain subsidy, once established, becomes within the political imagination of the Roman poor not a government program, but an entitlement, something owed to them by virtue of their citizenship, as natural and as non-negotiable as the air they breathe. Any politician who proposes reducing or eliminating it is not proposing a fiscal adjustment. He is proposing to take food from the mouths of the Roman people, and the Roman people have opinions about this that they are prepared to express with considerable physical emphasis. The subsidy expands. In 58 BC, the tribune Publius Clodius Pulcher, a populist politician of considerable energy and minimal scruple, operating in the turbulent last decades of the Republic, pushes through a further reform. The grain will no longer be sold at a subsidized price. It will be distributed free, no payment at all. The Lex Claudia de Frumento establishes what will become, over the following 5 centuries, the defining fiscal commitment of the Roman state: the free distribution of grain to the citizens of Rome, every month without charge, as a permanent institutional obligation that no subsequent government will find it politically possible to revoke. The number of recipients grows with the policy's generosity. By the late Republic, something in the range of 200,000 adult male citizens are receiving the monthly grain allocation, the frumentatio, from the state distribution points. Julius Caesar, arriving in Rome after crossing the Rubicon and finding the distribution rolls catastrophically inflated by decades of loose administration, conducts a census and reduces the recipient list to 150,000. The reduction is administrative, not political. Caesar cuts the rolls by identifying non-citizens, slaves, and duplicate entries, not by removing legitimate recipients. But even this administrative rationalization is understood to require the personal authority of a man who has just won a civil war. No politician operating through normal republican channels would have attempted it. Augustus, establishing the Principate after Caesar's assassination and the subsequent decades of civil war, looks at the grain dole and sees both a political necessity and an administrative opportunity. He cannot eliminate it. No Roman politician of any era can eliminate it, but he can rationalize it, systematize it, and turn it from a political weapon wielded by demagogic tribunes into a permanent institution of imperial governance. He creates the Cura Annoni, the office responsible for the grain supply of the city of Rome, eventually headed by a prefect of the Annona, a senior official whose entire function is ensuring that grain arrives in Rome in sufficient quantities at the right times to feed the population without interruption. The word Annona refers to the annual grain supply, and the Annona as an institution encompasses everything involved in moving grain from the fields of the provinces to the stomachs of the Roman urban population. The contracting with provincial grain producers, the management of the grain fleet that carries the harvests across the Mediterranean, the operation of the great storage warehouses, Horea, at Ostia and Rome itself, the administration of the distribution network through which the monthly allocation reaches its recipients, and the management of the price stabilization mechanisms that prevent market fluctuations from disrupting the supply between monthly distributions. The prefect of the Annona is, in practical terms, the minister responsible for feeding the largest city in the world, and the consequences of failure in that role are immediate, visible, and politically catastrophic. The logistical achievement the Annona represents is genuinely staggering. Rome in the imperial period requires something in the range of 270,000 tons of grain per year to feed its population. Wheat primarily, supplemented by barley, legumes, and olive oil, distributed through related systems. This grain comes overwhelmingly from two sources, Egypt and North Africa. Egypt under Roman rule is the single most productive agricultural territory in the known world. Its Nile-fed fields generating surplus grain on a scale that no rain-fed agricultural system in the Mediterranean can match. North Africa, the fertile coastal strip of what is now Tunisia and Libya, is the second great breadbasket. Its climate and soil producing harvests that, combined with Egyptian output, give Rome a supply base capable of feeding 1 million people year-round from fields located 1,000 miles away. The grain fleet that carries this harvest is one of the largest organized shipping operations in ancient history. Hundreds of vessels, ranging from modest coastal craft to the enormous grain freighters capable of carrying 1,000 tons of cargo, make the annual sailing from Alexandria and Carthage to Ostia, Rome's port at the mouth of the Tiber, in a sailing season bounded by the risks of Mediterranean winter storms. The fleet is not a military operation, but a commercial one. Private contractors operating under government supervision, paid fixed rates to carry the grain, subject to penalties for losses, and entitled to bonuses for reliable delivery. The state does not own the ships. It owns the contract, the oversight apparatus, and the political liability for what happens when the ships are late or the harvest fails. What Augustus builds with the Cura Annoni is not merely a food distribution system, it is a political stability machine. The urban poor of Rome, receiving their monthly grain allocation, are not merely fed, they are managed. A population that knows its basic nutrition is guaranteed by the state is a population with significantly less incentive to riot, to follow demagogic tribunes into the streets, to create the kind of urban disorder that destabilized the late Republic. The grain dole does not make the Roman poor politically passive. They remain capable of enthusiasm for popular causes, of enthusiasm for charismatic leaders, of the full range of political behaviors that large urban populations produce. But it removes the sharpest edge of economic desperation, the hunger that transforms grievance into violence with particular speed and unpredictability. The satirist Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century AD, gives this arrangement its most famous formulation: panem et circenses, bread and circuses. The people of Rome, he writes with bitter wit, have surrendered their political agency in exchange for grain allocations and gladiatorial spectacle, trading the right to govern themselves for the right to be fed and entertained. Juvenal intends the observation as criticism, a lament for the degeneration of Roman civic virtue. What he is also doing, perhaps without fully intending to, is describing a policy that has worked with extraordinary effectiveness for 2 centuries. The Roman state has purchased social peace in the world's largest city at the price of a permanent fiscal commitment, and the transaction has been, by any narrow measure of political stability, an exceptional bargain. The fiscal cost is the dimension that does not announce itself immediately, because the grain dole in its early centuries is genuinely affordable for an empire at the height of its extractive power. Egypt's grain surplus, delivered as a tax in kind rather than purchased on the market, means that a significant portion of the annona's supply costs the Roman treasury nothing beyond the logistics of moving it. Provincial tax revenues flow into Rome in quantities that make the distribution cost of feeding 200,000 citizens a manageable line item in an imperial budget supported by the tribute of 3 continents. During the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the Antonine period of relative peace and prosperity, the grain dole is a political institution of high efficiency, low cost, high return in terms of urban stability, and self-sustaining through the political logic that makes elimination impossible. The structural problem accumulates slowly across generations as the conditions that made the dole affordable begin to erode. The military crises of the 3rd century, the period of 50 years between 235 and 284 AD, during which the Roman Empire experiences over 50 emperors, most of them killed by their own soldiers, along with simultaneous invasions on multiple frontiers, epidemic disease, and catastrophic disruption of the provincial economies that generate the tax revenues the empire runs on, do not immediately affect the grain distribution in Rome. The capital city is sheltered from the worst of the chaos in ways the frontier provinces are not. But the crisis depletes the treasury, depreciates the currency through successive debasements as emperors mint more coins from less silver to pay armies that demand payment in silver, and begins the long erosion of the tax base that the entire system depends on. Diocletian, restructuring the empire at the end of the 3rd century after decades of near dissolution, recognizes that the grain distribution system has become a significant fiscal burden and responds by attempting to rationalize it, not eliminating the dole, which remains as politically impossible as it has always been, but extending versions of it to other major cities of the empire, including Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria, on the theory that urban stability in the empire's major population centers is worth subsidizing regardless of which city they are located in. The extension of the system multiplies its cost and commits the treasury to obligations across a wider geographic area, precisely at the moment when the empire's fiscal capacity to honor those obligations is under its most severe long-term pressure. Constantine's founding of Constantinople as a second capital in 330 AD creates a new and immediately voracious grain distribution obligation. The new city's population requires feeding at the level a Roman capital demands, which means establishing a dedicated grain supply system for Constantinople, drawing on the grain surplus of Egypt and the Black Sea region, in competition with Rome's own supply requirements. The empire is now running 2 major urban grain distribution systems simultaneously, both of them non-negotiable in political terms, from a fiscal base that has been shrinking for a century. The decisive blow comes not from internal fiscal pressure, but from external military reality. In 429 AD, the Vandals under Gaius cross from Spain into North Africa, the territory that provides approximately half of the Western Empire's grain supply and a large fraction of its tax revenue. By 439 AD, Gaius has captured Carthage, and with it effective control of North Africa's agricultural wealth. The Western Empire does not merely lose a province, it loses the economic foundation on which the western half of the grain supply system has been built, the tax revenues that have funded a significant portion of the Western military budget, and the logistical infrastructure through which North African grain has moved to Rome for 5 centuries. The Vandal conquest of North Africa is, in practical fiscal terms, the moment the Western Roman Empire becomes terminally insolvent. The grain dole in Rome continues in degraded form through the middle of the 5th century, supplied increasingly from reduced Egyptian allocations, supplemented by whatever the Italian agricultural hinterland can provide, managed by an imperial administration that is simultaneously trying to fund military campaigns against Vandals, Huns, Visigoths, and a rotating cast of internal usurpers, all from a tax base that has been losing territory and productive capacity for decades. The men who administer the anana in these final decades are not running a program. They are managing a decline, trying to honor an institutional commitment that the empire's fiscal reality has made impossible to fully honor while finding it politically impossible to formally abandon. When Odoacer deposes the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in 476 AD, and the Western Roman Empire formally ceases to exist, the grain dole ends with it. Not through any political decision, but simply because the institutional and logistical infrastructure required to operate it no longer exists under a government that controls neither Egypt nor North Africa, nor the sea lanes through which their grain would need to travel. The population of Rome, which had peaked at something over 1 million in the 2nd century AD, falls to perhaps 20 or 30,000 over the following 2 centuries, the city contracting around itself as the economic reason for its size. The grain dole, the political economy of the capital city, the concentration of imperial administration and its associated spending, dissolves with the empire that had created it. What the Roman grain dole demonstrates across its 6 centuries of operation is a specific and recurring pattern in the relationship between political expediency and fiscal sustainability. Gaius Gracchus creates it as a political weapon. His successors expand it because contraction is politically impossible. Augustus institutionalizes it because the political cost of elimination exceeds the fiscal cost of continuation. His successors inherit not a choice, but a commitment, are hardened over generations into something indistinguishable from a natural right that consumes an increasing share of a shrinking fiscal base while delivering diminishing political returns as the population that depends on it becomes accustomed to dependency rather than grateful for generosity. Every emperor who looks at the grain dole and recognizes its long-term fiscal danger faces the same calculation. The cost of elimination, measured in immediate political instability, is certain and large, while the cost of continuation, measured in long-term fiscal erosion, is diffuse and deferred. Rational actors with short time horizons make the rational choice. They continue the program. They pass the problem forward. And the empire that cannot stop feeding its capital eventually cannot afford to defend it.